"Margaret, you can eat in the kitchen if you want. The table's full." Those were the words my daughter-in-law said to me the moment my entire family sat down to eat the Thanksgiving dinner I had spent 12 hours cooking. I had just finished setting the last dish on the table when Emily smiled politely and said it, like she was offering me a favor instead of pushing me out of my own seat. I turned 70 that morning. 70 years old, and I was standing in the dining room of the house I had lived in for 38 years, holding a bowl of gravy while my family looked anywhere but at me. I remember thinking how strange it was that the room suddenly felt smaller. The dining table was the same oak table my husband Robert and I bought back in 1989 from a furniture store in Columbus, Ohio. It had survived birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and 40 Thanksgivings. The surface was scratched in places from the years, but I always thought those scratches were memories. That morning I woke up at 5 o'clock, long before the sun came up. The house was quiet then, the kind of quiet you only hear when everyone else is still asleep. I tied on my apron, the blue one with the faded sunflowers, and started the turkey. It was an 18-pound bird I bought 2 days earlier from the grocery store down the road. Robert used to say anything smaller wasn't a real Thanksgiving turkey. I rinsed it, seasoned it the way I had every year, and slid it into the oven while the coffee pot gurgled behind me. By 7 the kitchen smelled like sage, butter, and roasted garlic. I peeled 5 pounds of potatoes, mashed them with cream and butter, and started the stuffing. I baked 2 pumpkin pies and 1 apple pie because Daniel always liked apple better. Daniel is my son. He's 42 now, taller than his father ever was, and for most of his life he never missed a Thanksgiving at my house. When he married Emily 6 years ago, I thought our family had simply grown bigger. Emily arrived around 2 in the afternoon that day wearing a cream sweater and carrying a bottle of wine. She walked into my kitchen like she had been there 1,000 times, which she had, and gave me a quick hug that barely lasted a second. "Everything smells amazing, Margaret," she said as she looked around the counters. Then she started moving things. It was subtle at first. She shifted the cranberry sauce bowl to the other end of the counter. She replaced my folded napkins with one she had brought from her car. She even rearranged the chairs around the dining table, explaining she wanted the table to look more balanced for photos. I didn't say anything. I just kept stirring the gravy and reminding myself that families change. People add their own touches. By 4 o'clock the house was full. My grandchildren ran through the hallway laughing. My son opened another bottle of wine, and the turkey rested on the counter while I sliced it carefully. I carried the platter to the table, proud in the quiet way someone feels when they've done something well for the people they love. But when I looked down at the chairs, something felt off. There were 8 seats set at the table, 8 plates, 8 folded napkins. I counted them twice before I realized what was missing. There was no place for me. I stood there holding the gravy boat while everyone found their seats. Daniel sat next to Emily. The grandchildren climbed into their chairs. Someone turned on the football game in the living room. And that's when Emily looked up at me with that small, polite smile, and said the sentence that turned my 70th birthday into the quietest Thanksgiving of my life. I stood there for a moment longer, still holding the gravy boat, waiting for someone to notice the empty space where my seat should have been. No one said anything. The room filled with the sound of chairs sliding across the wooden floor, and the soft clatter of silverware touching plates. Daniel unfolded his napkin and placed it on his lap. Emily reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes and passed it to the children. The smell of roasted turkey and butter drifted through the room, warm and familiar. But suddenly it felt like it belonged to someone else's house. Emily looked up at me again, still smiling, as if she had offered the most reasonable solution in the world. She pointed toward the kitchen with a small tilt of her head. "There is plenty of space on the counter," she said gently. "You can sit there and relax after all that cooking." I nodded slowly because that was the only thing I could think to do. My hands felt steady, which surprised me. I placed the gravy boat on the table beside Daniel's plate and stepped away. The chair legs scraped softly behind me as someone adjusted their seat. No one stopped me. The kitchen was only 10 steps away, but the walk felt longer than it should have. The counter near the window was clear except for the cutting board and the carving knife I had used earlier. I set a small plate down and filled it quietly. A slice of turkey, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a spoonful of stuffing. The same meal everyone else was eating, just in a different room. Through the doorway I could see the edge of the dining table. I could hear the conversation beginning to warm up. The easy kind of laughter families share when they are comfortable. Someone mentioned the football game starting soon. One of the grandchildren asked for more cranberry sauce. The voices blended together into a low, cheerful noise. I pulled out one of the tall wooden stools we kept by the counter and sat down. The window above the sink looked out over the backyard where Robert used to rake leaves every November. The oak tree still stood there, its branches bare now, scattered with the last brown leaves of autumn. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the turkey. It tasted the same as it always did, tender and seasoned the way Robert liked it. For a moment I remembered the first Thanksgiving we hosted in this house. Daniel was only 4 years old then. He sat at the table swinging his feet because they could not reach the floor yet. Robert carved the turkey while telling a story about burning his first Thanksgiving dinner when he was 20. Everyone laughed so loudly that the neighbors probably heard us through the walls. I used to think those sounds would always fill this house. Another burst of laughter drifted from the dining room. I looked down at my plate and noticed the gravy had started to soak into the potatoes, spreading slowly across the surface. My fork paused halfway to my mouth when I heard Emily's voice again, clear and confident. She was telling someone about a dinner party she hosted the week before, explaining how important it was to arrange seating carefully, so that everyone felt comfortable. The words floated through the doorway and settled quietly in the kitchen. I finished another bite and set my fork down. The clock above the refrigerator ticked softly, marking each second in the quiet space around me. After a while Daniel's voice joined the conversation, deeper than the others but just as relaxed. He was describing a project at work, something about a new office building downtown. I listened to him speak the way a mother always listens to her child, even when he is a grown man with gray starting to appear at his temples. What struck me most was not what he said. It was what he did not say. At no point did he call my name. At no point did he stand up and bring another chair to the table. I sat there for several minutes, finishing the meal I had prepared for everyone else, and the longer I listened the clearer something became. The silence from my son was louder than anything Emily had said. I sat at the kitchen counter long after my plate was empty, listening to the voices drifting in from the dining room. The laughter grew louder as the meal went on, the kind of easy laughter people share when they feel completely comfortable. Every now and then a fork clinked against a plate or a chair scraped softly across the floor. It sounded like a normal Thanksgiving dinner. Anyone passing by the house would have thought a happy family was gathered around the table. I rinsed my plate slowly in the sink and dried it with the same white dish towel I had used for years. The fabric had grown thin with time, but it still did its job. When I hung it back on the oven handle, I glanced toward the doorway again. From where I stood I could see the corner of the dining table, and the soft glow of the chandelier hanging above it. I could not see every face, but I could hear them clearly. Emily's voice carried through the room as she described how she planned to host Christmas this year. She spoke with the confidence of someone who already believed the house belonged to her. She talked about rearranging the furniture in the living room and possibly replacing the dining chairs with something more modern. I leaned against the counter and folded my hands quietly. It was strange hearing someone make plans for a house they did not own. The thought stayed with me longer than I expected. A few minutes later one of the grandchildren ran into the kitchen looking for more soda. The little boy opened the refrigerator, grabbed a can, and rushed back to the table without noticing me standing there. Children rarely notice the quiet things happening around them. I did not blame him. I stepped over to the sink and poured myself a glass of water. The clock above the refrigerator showed a little past 5 in the evening. Outside the sky had turned that soft gray color that comes just before winter nights settle in. I carried my glass to the window and looked out across the backyard again. The grass had turned pale from the cold and the oak tree cast a long shadow over the fence. Robert used to string white lights along that fence every December. He said it made the yard feel warm even when the temperature dropped below freezing. I remembered him standing on a ladder one year, carefully clipping each light into place while Daniel held the extension cord below. Daniel could not have been more than 10 years old at the time. He kept asking his father if the lights would stay up all year. Robert laughed and told him that some things were special because they only happen once a season. The memory passed through my mind like a quiet breeze and then faded. Another round of laughter came from the dining room. This time Daniel's voice was mixed in with the others. I listened carefully, wondering if at some point he might stand up and walk into the kitchen to check on me. Maybe he would bring a chair. Maybe he would say something simple like, "Mother, come sit with us." But the minutes moved on and the doorway stayed empty. Eventually the sound of plates being cleared reached the kitchen. Someone mentioned dessert and Emily's footsteps approached the counter where the pies were cooling. She walked in without looking at me at first. Her attention went straight to the pumpkin pie. She picked it up, examined the crust, and nodded in approval. "These look perfect," she said calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened all evening. Then she finally glanced in my direction with that same polite expression she always wore. "Margaret, would you mind bringing the whipped cream when you come in?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. She spoke as though I had been standing in the kitchen by choice the entire time. As though the seat at the table had never existed at all. I reached into the refrigerator and picked up the small glass bowl of whipped cream I had prepared earlier that afternoon. The bowl felt cold in my hands. Emily turned and walked back toward the dining room without waiting for my reply. I followed a few steps behind her and paused at the doorway again. The same 8 chairs were still filled. The same plates sat in front of each person. And once again there was no place set for me at the table. I stood in the doorway for a moment holding the bowl of whipped cream while everyone continued talking as if nothing unusual had happened. The chandelier cast a warm light over the table, reflecting off the plates and glasses that I had set earlier that afternoon. Emily slid the pumpkin pie to the center of the table, and immediately began giving instructions about cutting it into equal slices. One of the grandchildren asked if there was apple pie too, and she smiled brightly and pointed toward the kitchen. I stepped forward quietly and placed the bowl beside the pies. No one moved a chair. No one looked surprised to see me standing there. Daniel glanced up for half a second, long enough for our eyes to meet, and then he looked back down at his plate. That brief moment stayed with me longer than the rest of the evening. I nodded once, even though he had not said anything, and turned back toward the kitchen before anyone could ask me to stay. The sound of the knife cutting through the pie crust followed me across the room. Back at the counter I wiped my hands slowly on the same sunflower apron I had worn since morning. The fabric smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Through the doorway I could hear Emily dividing the desserts with careful precision. Her voice cheerful and steady as she passed slices to everyone around the table. Someone complimented the pies. Another voice said the turkey had been perfect this year. Their words floated toward the kitchen like distant echoes. I leaned against the counter and watched the small red numbers on the microwave clock change from 5:18 to 5:19. It struck me how many hours had gone into this day. I had been awake since before sunrise, moving from stove to sink to oven in the quiet rhythm that comes from decades of doing the same thing every November. I used to enjoy that rhythm. It felt like a promise that the family would always come back to the same table. I picked up a clean dish and began washing the carving knife even though it was already clean. The water ran warm over my hands while laughter rose again from the dining room. A moment later the grandchildren ran into the kitchen carrying their empty plates. One of them asked if there was more whipped cream. I opened the refrigerator and handed them the can without saying much. They thanked me politely before rushing back to the table where the conversation never paused. When the kitchen was quiet again I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. My reflection in the window above the sink looked older than it had that morning. The gray in my hair caught the faint light from outside, and the lines around my eyes seemed deeper somehow. 70 years is a long time to live in one place. Long enough to watch the seasons change across the same backyard thousands of times. Long enough to remember when every chair at that table used to be filled with people who waited for me before starting dinner. I rested my hand on the edge of the counter and listened carefully to the voices drifting through the doorway. Emily was speaking again, explaining how next year Thanksgiving might be easier if they hosted it at their own place instead. She said it casually, the way someone suggests a new restaurant. A few people murmured in agreement. Daniel did not respond right away, but after a moment I heard him say that it might be a good idea since their house had a larger dining area. The words were calm and practical. There was no anger in them, no hesitation either. Just a simple plan for the future. I stood there quietly while that future settled into the room without me. After a while the chairs began to scrape against the floor again as people finished dessert. Someone mentioned turning on the football game in the living room, The familiar noise of family gathering shifted away from the table and toward the couch and television. I remained in the kitchen for a few seconds longer, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I reached for the small notebook that rested in the drawer beside the stove. It was the same notebook where I had written grocery lists and holiday menus for years. I opened it to a blank page and looked at the empty lines for a long moment. For the first time all day, I was not thinking about turkey or pies or dishes. I was thinking about something much simpler. I was thinking about what this house truly belonged to, and who would still be sitting at that table the next time November came around. I closed the notebook slowly and slid it back into the drawer beside the stove. The house had grown louder in the living room now. The football game had started and the television announcer's voice rose and fell with the crowd in the stadium. Every so often the grandchildren shouted when a play happened, their excitement bouncing through the hallway and into the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, listening, letting the sound pass through me the way wind passes through bare branches in November. The kitchen still smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I picked up the dish towel again and wiped a spot on the counter that was already clean. Sometimes the smallest movements help a person think more clearly. Through the doorway I could see part of the living room now. Daniel sat on the couch leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching the game with quiet focus. Emily had settled into the armchair near the window, her legs crossed neatly while she scrolled through something on her phone. One of the grandchildren climbed onto the carpet in front of the television while the other curled up beside Daniel. The room looked comfortable, relaxed, like a family that believed the day had gone exactly as planned. I stepped back from the doorway before anyone noticed me standing there. The kitchen light hummed softly above the sink. I poured the rest of the coffee from the pot into the drain and rinsed the glass carafe. The warm water fogged the window for a moment, blurring the view of the backyard until everything outside looked soft and distant. Robert used to stand at this same sink every evening after dinner, washing the dishes while humming a quiet tune I never learned the name of. He said it helped him unwind after work. I used to dry each plate and place it back in the cabinet while Daniel sat at the table doing homework. It seemed impossible now that so many years had passed since those evenings. Yet the cabinets were still the same ones Robert installed himself with a measuring tape and a borrowed drill. I could still see the tiny mark he left above the pantry door where the pencil slipped while he was measuring the frame. My fingers brushed that mark as I walked past it toward the hallway. The wooden floor creaked slightly under my steps, a familiar sound that had followed me through this house for nearly 4 decades. I paused near the coat rack where the grandchildren had left their jackets piled on top of each other. One small mitten had fallen onto the floor. I picked it up and set it carefully on the bench. Even after everything that had happened that evening, the habits of caring for a home did not disappear so easily. I walked into the dining room then, the room where the table still held the empty plates and the crumbs from dessert. The chandelier cast a soft yellow circle of light across the oak surface. I moved slowly around the table, gathering the dishes one by one and stacking them in my arms. 8 plates. 8 forks. 8 folded napkins now crumpled and stained with pie filling. The chair at the head of the table remained slightly pushed back from where Daniel had stood earlier. I looked at it for a moment before sliding it back into place. The sound of the chair legs against the floor echoed quietly in the room. For years that chair had belonged to Robert. After he passed away I never moved it. Somehow it felt wrong to sit there myself. I carried the stack of dishes back into the kitchen and set them gently beside the sink. The house continued buzzing with the sound of the football game and distant laughter. I washed each plate carefully, one after another, letting the steady rhythm of the water fill the silence around me. When the last dish was finally placed in the rack to dry, I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. The kitchen felt different now. Not sad. Just clear in a way it had not been earlier. I opened the drawer again and looked at the small notebook resting where I had left it. This time I did not hesitate. I took out a pen and wrote a single name on the first blank line. The name belonged to a man who had helped Robert and me sign the papers for this house many years ago. A lawyer in downtown Columbus who still sent a Christmas card every December. I closed the notebook again and placed it carefully on the counter beside the telephone. The evening outside had grown darker, and the first cold wind of the night brushed against the window. Somewhere in the living room someone cheered at the television. I stood quietly in the kitchen and listened to the sound for a moment before reaching toward the phone. My hand rested on the telephone for a moment before I picked it up. The plastic felt cool against my fingers, the same way it always had on quiet evenings when Robert used to call old friends or check on Daniel when he was away at college. The number I had written in the notebook was one I had not dialed in several years, but I still remembered it well enough. Some numbers stay with you because they were once connected to important decisions. I pressed the button slowly, listening to the soft tones echo in the kitchen, while the football game roared faintly in the living room. After 3 rings, a calm voice answered. It was older now than I remembered, but steady and polite. I introduced myself and there was a short pause on the line before the man laughed gently in recognition. He said it had been far too long since we last spoke and asked how I had been doing. I told him I was doing fine and that I hoped he and his family were well. Then I explained that I might need to schedule a meeting sometime next week. There was nothing urgent in my voice. No anger. Just a simple request for a conversation about a few personal matters regarding the house and my estate. The lawyer listened quietly and said he would be happy to see me. He suggested Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I told him that time would work perfectly. We wished each other a pleasant holiday and the call ended as calmly as it had begun. When I placed the receiver back on its cradle, the kitchen felt unusually still. The only sound left was the distant cheer of the football crowd coming from the television down the hall. I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the small notebook lying open on the counter. The single name written across the page seemed simple enough, yet it carried the weight of every memory this house held. I closed the notebook carefully and placed it beside the fruit bowl where the light from the overhead lamp could reach it. Then I turned toward the doorway and walked slowly into the hallway. The living room was bright and lively compared to the quiet kitchen behind me. Daniel and the children were watching the game with the kind of focus that makes people forget everything else around them. Emily sat comfortably in the armchair with a glass of wine resting in her hand. She laughed at something one of the commentators said on the television and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. No one seemed to notice when I stepped into the room. I stood there for a few seconds observing the scene the way someone might watch a photograph come to life. Families often look peaceful from a distance. It is only when you step closer that you notice the empty spaces between people. One of the grandchildren finally spotted me and waved cheerfully. I smiled back and asked if anyone wanted more pie or coffee. A few heads turned briefly, and someone answered that everything had been wonderful. Emily thanked me again for the meal and said the turkey might have been the best one yet. Her voice carried the same pleasant tone she had used all evening. I nodded politely and told them I was glad they enjoyed it. After that, the conversation drifted back to the game, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. I returned to the kitchen without saying much else. Outside the window, the sky had turned completely dark and the wind brushed lightly against the glass. I turned off the overhead light and let the softer lamp near the stove illuminate the room instead. The house felt different now, but not in a way that frightened me. It felt clear, almost peaceful, like the quiet moment after a long day when everything finally settles into place. I walked to the counter, picked up the notebook again, and slid it into the small drawer beside the telephone. Tuesday morning was only a few days away. For the first time since the dinner began, I felt certain about what would happen next. The house grew quiet later that night after the game ended and everyone began gathering their coats near the front door. The grandchildren were the first to leave the living room, their voices still full of energy as they searched for their shoes and scarves. I stood near the hallway watching them move through the house with the restless excitement that only children carry after a long day. One of them hugged me quickly before running outside where the cold air waited on the porch. The front door opened and closed several times as the family prepared to leave. The sound of winter wind slipped into the house for a few seconds each time before the door shut again. Emily was the last to step into the hallway. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders and looked around the living room with a satisfied expression, as if she had just finished hosting a successful gathering. "Thank you again for dinner," she said politely while adjusting the strap of her purse. "Everything turned out wonderful." Her voice carried the same calm confidence it had all evening. I smiled and told her I was glad everyone enjoyed the meal. Daniel stood beside her holding the car keys in one hand while the other rested casually in his jacket pocket. He looked tired but relaxed, the way people often look after a big holiday dinner. For a brief moment it seemed like he might say something more, perhaps ask if I needed help cleaning up or offer to stay a little longer. Instead, he simply leaned forward and gave me a quick hug. "Drive safe tomorrow if you go anywhere," he said quietly, as if the words had appeared in his mind at the last second. I nodded and told him not to worry. The porch light cast a pale glow across the driveway when they stepped outside. I watched from the doorway while the children climbed into the back seat of the car, and Emily settled into the passenger side. Daniel started the engine and the headlights swept across the yard for a moment before the car rolled slowly down the street. When the red tail lights finally disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood returned to its usual stillness. I closed the front door and turned the lock gently. The sound echoed softly through the empty hallway. For the first time all day, the house belonged only to silence. I walked back into the kitchen where the faint smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey still lingered in the air. The dishes were already clean and stacked neatly in the drying rack beside the sink. The small lamp near the stove cast a warm circle of light across the counter where the notebook drawer rested. I poured myself a fresh glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table, the smaller table Robert had built years ago when Daniel was a boy. From there I could see into the dining room where the large oak table stood perfectly still under the chandelier. 8 chairs were pushed neatly into place around it. I studied that table for a long moment, remembering how many holidays had gathered around it over the years. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, quiet Sunday dinners. Robert's laughter used to fill that room so easily that the walls seemed to carry the sound long after the evening ended. I stood up slowly and walked into the dining room. My hand brushed the smooth edge of the oak surface as I moved past the chairs. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers, solid and familiar. Near the center of the table, a few crumbs from the pie remained where someone had missed them while clearing the plates. I wiped them away with a folded napkin and placed the napkin neatly beside the centerpiece. The chandelier light reflected softly across the polished wood. In that quiet moment, something became very clear to me. A house can hold decades of memories, but it does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the person who built the life inside its walls. I turned off the chandelier and walked back into the kitchen where the small drawer beside the telephone waited. When I opened it, the notebook was exactly where I had left it. Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I closed the drawer again and turned out the lamp near the stove. The house settled gently into darkness, and for the first time that evening I felt completely certain that the next holiday would not unfold the same way. I woke before sunrise the following Tuesday, the same way I had woken before sunrise on Thanksgiving morning. Old habits stay with you after 70 years. The house was quiet and the winter air outside carried a pale blue light through the kitchen window. I made a simple breakfast and poured a cup of coffee, then sat at the small table Robert had built decades ago. The notebook rested beside my plate, closed but very present. I did not rush that morning. There was no turkey to prepare, no table to set, no voices filling the rooms. Just the quiet ticking of the clock above the refrigerator, and the faint hum of the heater as it pushed warm air through the house. At 9 o'clock I put on my coat and stepped outside. The cold air brushed against my face as I walked to the car parked in the driveway. Frost still clung to the edges of the windshield and the grass in the yard shimmered faintly under the morning sun. The drive into downtown Columbus took about 20 minutes, the same route Robert and I had taken many times over the years whenever paperwork or business brought us into the city. The streets were calm that morning, lined with bare trees and brick buildings that looked unchanged since the last time I visited. When I arrived at the office building, I recognized it immediately. The brass letters beside the door still displayed the same law firm name they had carried for decades. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. The receptionist greeted me kindly and asked me to have a seat while she let the attorney know I had arrived. I sat in a leather chair near the window and looked out at the street below where people hurried along the sidewalk with their coats wrapped tightly around them. After a few minutes, the office door opened and the lawyer stepped into the room. His hair had turned almost completely gray since the last time I saw him, but his voice and posture were just as steady as before. He shook my hand warmly and thanked me for coming in. We walked together into his office where shelves of thick legal books lined the walls. I took a seat across from his desk and placed the notebook gently in front of me. He asked how I had been and whether the house was still treating me well after all these years. I told him the house was doing exactly what houses do. It was standing strong and holding its memories. Then I explained that I wanted to make a few changes regarding the future of the property, and the estate Robert and I had built together. The lawyer listened carefully without interrupting. Occasionally he nodded and made small notes on a yellow legal pad beside him. I spoke calmly, choosing each word the way someone chooses the right piece of wood when building a sturdy table. There was no anger in the conversation, no raised voices, just a clear explanation of how I wanted things arranged from this day forward. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair and reviewed the notes he had written. After a moment he said he understood completely, and that the changes could be prepared without difficulty. He explained that new documents would need to be drafted and signed, but the process itself was straightforward. I thanked him and told him I would be ready to sign whatever needed signing. As we spoke, sunlight moved slowly across the office window and rested briefly on the edge of his desk. It struck me then how ordinary the moment felt. No dramatic arguments. No heavy emotions. Just a simple conversation between two people discussing the future of a house that had stood quietly for nearly 40 years. When the meeting ended, he walked me back to the front door and wished me a peaceful holiday season. I stepped outside again and looked up at the clear winter sky. The air felt colder than it had that morning, but also sharper, as if everything around me had come into focus. I drove home slowly through the familiar streets until the house appeared at the end of my block just as it always had. The oak tree still stood in the yard and the porch light waited quietly above the front door. I parked the car and sat there for a moment before going inside. The meeting downtown had not changed the house itself. The walls were the same. The table was the same. But the future inside those walls had just shifted in a way no one at that Thanksgiving dinner could possibly see yet. Winter settled slowly over the neighborhood in the weeks that followed. The oak tree in my yard lost its last leaves and the cold air carried that quiet stillness that always comes before December. Life inside the house continued at its usual pace, but something inside me had shifted in a calm and permanent way. On the second Tuesday after Thanksgiving, I returned to the same office downtown and signed the documents the lawyer had prepared. The process was simple and unremarkable. A few pages placed neatly on a desk, a pen passed gently across the table, and my name written carefully at the bottom of each line. When the final page was finished, the lawyer placed the papers into a folder and nodded once with quiet understanding. We spoke for a few more minutes about ordinary things before I stepped back out into the winter air. Driving home that afternoon felt different somehow. The streets looked the same, the traffic lights changed at the same steady rhythm, and the shops along the road were already hanging Christmas decorations in their windows. Yet the weight I had been carrying since that Thanksgiving dinner had disappeared without noise or drama. The following Sunday Daniel called to check in. His voice sounded casual, almost cheerful, the way it usually did when he spoke about weekend plans or the children's school activities. He asked if I was feeling well, and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. I told him I was doing just fine and thanked him for asking. We spoke for a few minutes about the weather and the early snow that had fallen north of the city. Then he mentioned that Emily had been thinking about hosting Christmas dinner at their house this year since their dining room could fit a larger table. I listened quietly and told him that sounded like a lovely idea. There was a short pause on the phone after I said that. Perhaps he expected an argument or disappointment in my voice, but there was none. The truth was that the holiday plans no longer mattered the way they once had. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the counter and looked across the kitchen toward the dining room. The oak table stood in the same place it always had, its surface polished and still beneath the chandelier. I walked into the room and rested my hand gently on the back of one of the chairs. For nearly 40 years that table had held every kind of memory a family could create. It had seen laughter, celebration, quiet conversations, and the passing of seasons. What it had never seen until that Thanksgiving evening was the moment I realized that respect cannot be borrowed from others. It must come from knowing the value of the life you built with your own hands. A few days later, a small envelope arrived in the mail from the lawyer's office confirming that the changes were complete. I read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the same drawer beside the telephone where the notebook used to rest. Outside the window, the porch light flickered on as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops. The house remained quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of the heater and the distant rustle of winter wind against the trees. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the calm inside those walls. Next Thanksgiving the table would still be here. The house would still stand strong beneath the old oak tree. But one thing would be very different. No one would ever again decide where I was allowed to sit in the home that had carried my entire life.